Okay, there you go. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Claire. I know some of you. I don't know some of you. So I'm very grateful that you've come. We've been a bunch of us working around this field of advocating for deliberative democratic processes for quite a long time. Lots of people here from different kind of positions and places in a sort of landscape or an ecosystem, I would say, of people who are doing different work around this. And myself and Jamie and Alex and a few other people here have been working on a project called Hard Art, which is trying to convene creatives and cultural producers and people who are going to help to popularize the ideas of new infrastructure for governance and government. And for me also, I've been working on this project called the Humanity Project, which is trying to do some work from the kind of grassroots, self-organized, participatory democracy kind of perspective. I suppose, this conversation to me is very important, and also, this kind of work as a development from what started for me with the climate movement, saying that you need different people to use a different process to come to different decisions, so that you make decisions that don't create termination of civilization or total annihilation of everything that lives on the planet. The idea that you need to do those new processes in different ways in order to tackle that problem is the beginning point for me. But having seen lots of things play out, in particular the sort of the French Convention and the UK Climate Assembly, things that have happened which had the kind of good grace of the state saying, yes, here you go, you can have your process, then meeting massive issues around power in terms of getting anything to change, getting the things to happen that people have decided together that they think are the right course of action. So it's led me to thinking around different ways of working with ideas of democratic renewal, and particularly thinking about power, trying to think about social power, trying to think about the possibilities and the limitations that are kind of inherent within spaces around that are looking at democratic innovation. Because of my background, what I find very important is the idea that people can self-organize and they can make space for themselves, without necessarily needing permission or a huge budget or whatever. But there's also, lots of wonderful people in the sort of practitioner and academic space who I've met over the recent years who, those of us who try to do work on the ground, as it were, have got a lot to learn from. So these sessions are, we've got a series, and we're hoping that they're going to further the discussion around some of the trickier elements of assembly concepts, I guess, and some of the inspiration for the sort of thorns or the issues we're trying to look at have come directly from some of the people on this call. The connection and sort of cross-discipline bridge building is also really important to me, because I think getting some of these issues out of the academic space and into a more sort of diverse set of people who do different practices, from writers and illustrators and various other things, to sort of weave thinking spaces together where there's a lot of cross-discipline thinking that becomes possible to sort of break things out of maybe some silos that sometimes academic work can be in. And for this session, I've been talking to Graham Smith, and he actually helped me a lot to think about how to run this as a sort of series of conversations, roundtables. And really, on his recommendation, I think it's become a much more thorough process. So thanks, Graham, because he said, why don't you do a problem definition for each kind of question, so you really know what the question is. So I did that with Graham for this one, and I may as well just hand over to you, Graham, and you can sort of set the focus of the conversation. I think people have seen a pre-recorded sort of short conversation about it, but if you could just reintroduce it perhaps after David does his housekeeping and setting up the space, because he's going to facilitate.
Yes. So hello, everybody. I'm David. I'm going to be your facilitator for the evening. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming along. One of the things about facilitating people who work in this space is, of course, many of you are yourselves expert facilitators and will have your own views and styles about how things should be done. So I hope you'll give me permission to try things out. And if I make mistakes, I apologize in advance. We are trying to embody those values about citizen participation, but sometimes things go awry. I'm just going to quickly cover the ground rules and then our agenda for the evening. So 2 ground rules, really: respect and confidentiality. So when it comes to respect, please, can you respect each other and your views by default? So respecting different views, we know that there are some passionately held views, and we look forward to hearing them, but of course not everyone will agree with each other, and that's fine. Please respect each other that way. Also respecting each other's time. So we have promised you we will be finished by 8:30 UK time. We will be. And that means I hope you'll give me permission to interrupt you or nudge you or say to you, please speed up now, so that we give everyone a chance as much as possible to speak and share their insights and their thoughts. In terms of our agenda, the flow is basically going to be this. So in a moment, we're going to break into small groups of 3. This is the bridging introductions. You'll have a minute each to introduce who you are and your connection to this question. Then we'll come back and then we'll hear the much trailed setup and problem definition from Graham. And he's got a maximum of 5 minutes to do that. And then we'll move on to you for stories for insight. So I think Alex has nudged you a couple of times this week to bring some stories you'd like to tell. We've had some people come back and say they've got some stories. So we'll invite people to share their stories from insight. And then as we get into the last half hour, 20 minutes or so, we'll try to draw out some themes from those. So we'll move into having themes. Claire will have a first go at summarizing the themes that she's heard. And of course, people can respond, disagree, agree, magnify, or what have you. And then finally, we'll close and we will finish at 8:30, come hell or high water. So that is where we're at. One final thing is there is a couple of people who are not on video and even on video, but are here more as creatives. So Claire mentioned hard art. One of the things about hard art is we think that we want outputs which are more than just dry, dusty PDFs which stay on a shared drive somewhere and nobody ever reads. So whether that's poems or paintings or what have you. So we have some creatives watching all of our different assembly dialogues, and they have a chance to produce something quite different that will engage people coming out of all of this process. So you may see them in the background, and that's what they're up to. And with all of that, hopefully everyone is ready to start. And also, hopefully, Alex has got the breakout groups ready to go. Alex, you can give me a thumbs up. So it'll say 4 minutes just to give you a little bit of room. But please, each of you, 1 minute to introduce yourself to each other and how, yes, what's your connection to this question? What's your connection to this field? So if everyone is okay, and I can't see anybody looking like they're freaking out as if they're in the wrong meeting or if they don't understand anything which has been said so far. So therefore, I think we should go ahead. Alex, please put us into the different groups. It's a wider group. And of course, everyone will have a chance to talk to each other later. But for now, we hand over to Graham for 5 minutes maximum, setting up this question for us. Over to you, Graham.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think for many of us who have been involved in sort of particularly in activist spaces, the kind of confusion over the last few years around sort of what's a popular assembly or what's a people's assembly and what's a citizens assembly has been frustrating to say the least. And I think it's really great that Claire and colleagues are trying to figure out both the sort of different logics at play and how they might interact with each other. So I think this is a great initiative. I'm an academic, so I have to take us back to Greece. And if anyone plays that rhetorical strategy, you immediately think they're going to start talking about the virtues of sortition. But actually, the reason I want to take us back to Greece, because actually the main institution in Greece was a popular assembly. was actually the ecclesia, and which actually had the control of the final decision making on legislation. It appointed most of the key key figures like generals and magistrates, and it could call people to account. And this was like a meeting of over 6,000 citizens at any one time. And the interesting thing about that is the institutions around that were all sortition based, but they weren't like the kind of citizens assemblies we've got now. But what I think is interesting about that is that immediately we go back to, in the Western world, the place that we think about democracy. There's already an interaction between the kind of idea of a popular gathering and the idea of using sortition for other functions within the political system. And so in terms of the kinds of things that humanity and hard art and others are thinking about, is clearly these things can work together, but the challenge is trying to work out what that interaction looks like. In terms of my background, as most of you probably know, is with democratic lottery and sortition-based assemblies. But my earlier work was much more around these sort of popular assemblies, and particularly around participatory budgeting. And we often forget that the kind of key institution within participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre were these kind of popular assemblies. We can also tell stories about the New England town meetings, or about sort of organizations as Zapatistas or the Occupy movement, all of these different organizations at the heart using a popular assembly. And we should really remember this kind of democratic lottery assemblies are kind of new kids on the block. They are a relatively recent formulation, a recent institution. But I think we've got to sort of, as I said in the initial conversation with Claire, is that there are really different logics at play here, I think. And these are logics that can be complementary, but they also can be conflictual at different points. And I think that around popular assemblies, the kind of anybody who wants to be in the assembly can be there. The idea that actually very often they're vehicles for mobilization. There's often quite hot deliberation in those spaces, but they are not designed by default to be a broad representation of the community. It's those people who at that moment in time want to be present, want to be active, and want to do something together. They often generate mobilization out of them. They generate a kind of agency out of them. And I think that differs, well, we know that differs from sortition, where we're really aiming to get a diversity of people which look like the wider population. And we're trying very often to facilitate a much more, not necessarily more reflective, but we're trying to support a deliberation amongst those and trying to get those different voices heard. But I think, you know, and many people talk about that as a way of generating collective wisdom or other ideas like that. But I think unlike popular assemblies, they often lack agency afterwards. I think there's a really interesting kind of dynamic there. So one of the things that we can think about is how these start, you know, and it's one of the things we're going to be talking about today, is how they can integrate, both in terms of being agenda setters for each other, in terms of accompanying each other, or thinking about them after, you know, in sequence with each other. And I think that's the challenge we've got, because those different logics are appealing in their own right, but they also can generate tensions in relation to each other. And I think for us to kind of explore where they can be, where there's a real synthesis which can actually bring democratic power, is the challenge that we face. And I shall leave it there.
Wonderful. And just before I was about to start messaging you even more loudly about being on time, so that was dead on 5 minutes. Thank you very much. So we've heard Graham give us the setup. What I'd like to do now is move into some stories for insight. We've got lots of people in the room, the virtual room, who have lots of different kinds of experience which speak to this question and speak to the problem definition as just unpacked by Graham. And so rather than have abstract claims and assertions, we want to try to ground things in what people have been doing and the experiences they've had and the stories they can share. So, oh, we've got a new person, but Alex, if you could just check if that's someone we're expecting. I was wondering if anyone had a story they would like to share, and as you know, Alex, email people in advance. So I know there's at least one person who has a story they'd like to share. And to that end, I wonder if Claire, you would like to go first with your story.
Claire with an I.
Claire
Yeah.
rather than Claire. So we have to do a bit of Spice Girls, don't we? Claire M.
Claire M. So in 2 minutes, so my story, if you go back in June 2020, the assembly members from the French Citizens Convention on climate are voting on their 150 proposals, and they're at the point where they're about to vote on the proposal, which is on 4 days working week, and that's the very final stage of the process after 6 sessions, and they decide to not put that recommendation to the final kind of vote, because they feel that the French population wouldn't understand what they've been going through, and so that it would backfire. They would be seen as hard radical leftist, etc., etc. And for me, that was the moment where I realized that the opportunity and the missing opportunity actually to bring the wider population on the kind of learning journey that they went through. And that's where the idea for me of the community assembly came up, that we then developed for the Global Assembly. And that was one model. We just thought, why not do community assemblies that would create vicarious, is that how you say, learning for people who are not part of the assembly itself, try to create that kind of momentum for shared learning. And that's the learning for me from the Global Assembly, is that's one way of using popular community assemblies. But I'm really interested in how actually these assemblies could be there for agenda setting, because I think at the moment, that's where I think there's more potential, because the agenda of these assemblies is very much, at the moment, when they're commissioned by power holders, is very top down. So could we have community assemblies that create a mandate, not a mandate, but a mandate or a framing question or a topic that a sortition selected assembly can discuss and deliberate on?
Great, thank you, Claire. And thank you also for exemplifying something I was going to mention, which is, given that we have at least 2 types of gathering that we're thinking about, to be really clear on which one you mean when you're talking about it, I think will help everybody. And you did that right at the end there about the distinction between the popular assemblies setting the agendas, which might be then picked up by a sortition assembly. Thank you. Is anyone very keen to go next? I can physically see hands if they go up. I think, Susan, you put your hand up.
Yeah, I'm happy to go. So in 2 minutes. So my story happened this year. So I've delivered quite a few sortition-based assemblies. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. I haven't got as much experience about the people's assemblies. And what I find in all of those assemblies through the sortition process is that people come quite cynical. So I do a lot of the onboarding because I'm going to be leading the assemblies and I want to build that relationship with them at the start. And I spend a lot of time trying to convince them it's independent and they will get balanced information and how they select the experts and all of that sort of information. So I watch that cynicism right from the start, and people join mainly because of the money or because they're a bit intrigued about what's going on here. Then let me get in and understand these people who might be trying to pull the wool over my eyes type thing. Anyway, there was a guy there who was typically that at the start of a trade and climate assembly that we did this year. It was really complex because we were looking at trade policy tools and how they could influence the climate change. So we were asking the assembly to deal with 2 very complex issues and bring them together. anyway, this guy was really objectionable at the beginning, and he was very vocal. Him, and then there were a few others that were had opposing views to him, but you know, good facilitation, design, etc. It was fine. There was no sort of animosity, but you could really feel the passion of him. And at the end, we did 13 sessions with them, and at the end of that process, he walked up to me right at the end and he put his hands up to do a high five, and he said, "I've got to tell you, never in a million years would I have believed I could come to the same conclusion as some other people in this room." He said, "Never in a million years would I have thought that I would even be in the same room as some of these people, let alone be able to compromise with them." And he said, "You know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking that the government like it that way. They like to position us against each other in the community. And actually, if you put people together, we can come up with some bloody good ideas. And I'm really pleased with this." He said, "Thank you so much. I can't tell you, it's been life-changing in my view of the world." For me, that was amazing because it was such a complex assembly to deliver. And yet they all they loved it. And I do believe that they can generate agency. I haven't delivered an assembly yet which hasn't had people wanting to take further action, but I do think it's a gap with the sortition-based assemblies that we haven't got that factored in, and we are doing some of that with this assembly. But just give an indication, we finished in July. You know what it's like writing up these reports, and I'm doing it with an academic, so it's in Queen Mary's. So we've got annual leave and stuff, so it's not quite finished, the report, and I've got them writing to me saying, "When's the report? We want to know what we're doing with it. What can we do? How can we take these recommendations forward?" So I think it does generate an appetite for agency, even if we don't have the mechanisms in place. So I think it brings a sense of community cohesion, that sort of getting to understand each other in a nice, fair and structured way. But they love the topics as well, topics they might not have even been that interested in. They come for the money and suddenly they're interested in trade policy. And they just love the idea of engaging in democracy. So for me, the sortition-led ones that are top down, I think have a lot of value in terms of knowledge raising and generating civic engagement. Whereas the people's assemblies, I think my provocative question back on people's assemblies would be, haven't we always been able to mobilise in a democracy? What makes that different to the sortition ones?
Great provocation, thank you. Come for the money, leave with the trade policy expertise. There's a slogan I didn't realise I was going to be able to have today. Who would like to follow on Susan's point? Particularly if it's to do with that last provocation, that's even better. But Jamie, you've just put up your hand.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. I thought that was really great, and it inspired me to share this quick story. So, I was a big part of the Occupy movement, and since then I've facilitated about 200 people's assemblies myself. And that thing about agency is really, really powerful. So, you know, continually we'd see people take the mic for 2 minutes and they'd be confident, cocky, educated, and there'll be quite a few, you know, there's thousands of us there, right? There'll be quite a few hands going, "Good point, well made." And then you'd have this one person in particular I'm thinking of, and she'd have Lambert and Butler in one hand and the mic in the other, and she'd start by saying, "I am fucking terrified." And she is the opposite to privilege. So she'd left school at 12. She's got 5 kids, spent half her life in hostels. But when she said, "I'm terrified," she was vulnerable. And then she just proceeded. By the end, there's like a forest of hands of joy. It's like the angels singing. And the point I'm making, I witnessed every day 2 things. One is I know nothing. I know absolutely nothing. But when we have the whole crowd and you listen, then we are very, very wise, more than the sum of our parts, all that stuff. But the other thing I learned was what happens when those without agency get agency. They're the bomb and they can change everything. By the same token, with sortition chosen citizens assemblies, there's the super famous story. I mean, basically, they are anti-polarization machines. And the famous one in Dublin, the same-sex marriage one, a lot of people will know this, so I'll just give you a quick sketch. Very homophobic bloke gets chosen by sortition. 12 weekends in a row. He keeps sitting with a very camp 22-year-old young man. At the beginning, I wanted to kill him. At the end, this is the grandson I never had. I'd die for him. I was trigger warning. I won't go into the complete details, but when he was young, something awful happened to him. this old guy, and it's the first time I've spent my whole life in fear and fury and anger and pain. This is the first time I've been able to open up about it. This young man's done that for me. And so that, if you imagine that story repeated thousands of times throughout well-facilitated assemblies around the world, it boils down, it melts polarization. So these are really powerful aspects of what we're doing. Both is on offer, whether it's sortition chosen or whether it's participatory. Both is on offer.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jamie. Just looking around the faces for who would like to go next and share their story relating to our question. Was everyone still stunned by the stories we've heard so far?
Perry and Stephen had a couple of good ones. Perry, are you up for sharing?
Sure. Put me in the waiting room if I'm still talking after 2 minutes. In 2018, 2 select committees of Parliament commissioned a Citizens Assembly on adult social care. And we did a project called Citizens Assembly Plus. We took all their materials and their thinking and their results, and we turned them into a discussion kit that anybody who wanted to could do. And 200 people in groups around the country did so. So 3 points about that. So one is, it was an experience for those people. It was a small experience, it was 2 hours, but it was an experience. They didn't read about it, didn't watch the video, they shared some of the experience. Secondly, we could build on some of what the Assembly did. The Assembly members were offered caps on social care costs they could choose from. All those caps were in money terms. In the discussion, some people in the Assembly said, should be a percentage, no time to explore it. We were able to explore it and to find that among our participants, 5 in 6 thought that was a really good idea. So, and thirdly, this is about complementarity, but maybe at the expense of agency. That's it.
Cool. Thank you, Perry. You didn't get close to being chucked into the waiting room, so well done for that. Now, also, we know that, Stephen, do you have a story that you would like to share?
Yeah, hi, everyone. So firstly, just to say that I do think the distinction between people's assemblies and sortition assemblies, they are different things, and the difference is important, but I do think they can both play a role in a democratic system, but they bring different democratic goods. So it is about how to combine them. So I think this is a really interesting agenda. So thanks for inviting me to this round table. Just before I tell my story, just to comment on the possibility of people's assemblies setting the agenda for a sortition assembly. I think it's an interesting one. I think there is some scope to do that. My issue is that people's assemblies may attract people with a shared agenda or shared view on a particular topic. As Graham was saying, you know, they can be vehicles for mobilization. So if they were agenda setters, the agenda could be skewed. So we need to ensure that different types of people's assembly or popular assembly got to set the agenda for the sortition assemblies. It can't just be from one movement. But my story and my suggestion then actually comes from the first Citizens Assembly in British Columbia on electoral reform, which is almost exactly 20 years ago now. And in that assembly, the assembly members held public hearings in their communities where they could discuss the ideas and the progress that they'd been making around electoral reform with members of the public who were not included in the Citizens Assembly. So they could hear from other people what they thought about the issue, and also to have to actually explain what the sortition assembly was thinking on the issue and justify it. And this is an important aspect that's been sort of dropped from citizen assembly practice since then. But I do think it's an interesting way of how a sortition assembly could be linked with people's assemblies. So people from the sortition assembly would go and visit these different people assemblies in their communities and discuss these issues. Be a two-way conversation. And one of the critiques of sortition assemblies is that, you know, a small number of people are ultimately involved in them. So linking people's assemblies with sortition assemblies in this way could bring more people into the conversation.
Wonderful. And I think that might also relate to what Claire was saying at the start in her story. I'm just looking around for Claire about how making sure the learning and the insight didn't just stay with those people who happened to be selected by the sortition. So that's part of what I think I heard there. And you're opening the thought something which I think we'll come back to, about which was Graham's last question about how these different kinds of assemblies can interact with each other, being careful on the people's assemblies setting the agenda for sortition, because those people's assemblies may have their own kind of biases because of who wants to turn up to them. That's fantastic. We may have one, or we've got somebody who's put the actual virtual hand up. Wonderful. Steph, what would you like to tell us? What story would you like to share?
So I think that's a brilliant story, Stephen, because in a sense, that is exactly what we are now starting to try and do. So linking, so I work for Involve, and so we run sortition-based assemblies and other deliberative processes, is trying to link having community conversations where we will train people to go out into their community and come back and then feed into the more formal processing of a sortition assembly, because there is this kind of scale challenge with sortition-based assemblies in terms of the volume of people that you can reach, and that there's a need to broaden out that sort of experience and opportunity. So that's kind of, that's not really a proper story. I do have a sort of interesting story from yesterday. So we're doing a whole load of system visioning with local authorities at the moment, as a sort of route to having conversations about net zero. And we are recruiting local people with no experience of facilitation to work with us on that in order to kind of increase our sort of local base. And we came up against a sort of, why can't you just give us the money that you've got and we'll run a sort of people's assembly kind of question. So there is a sort of, so there's a very real tension of resourcing here, which is like, which is the sort of thing that kind of creates the tension and divide that we need to be able to sort of overcome as part of this conversation. I am really sort of optimistic that this is about an ecosystem of change, and these are two different things, but there are real tensions, I guess, within that.
Cool. Thank you. Marit, what story would you like, or response would you like to share?
Yes, I don't actually have a story, because really my bread and butter is the abstract stuff. But is it okay to add a provocation and perhaps a quest for further stories?
Sure, please do.
Because I just wondered, based on what Stephen said and what Steph just said, I kind of wondered sometimes, so a hesitation I have about the sortition side of things is that because of the concern that otherwise assemblies attract the usual suspects, we want sortition to create representativeness and diversity, but almost actually precisely by inviting people who are non-political. So I almost wonder whether there's such a concern for, not having the usual suspects or having people kind of with already partial views in the room, that it almost ends up silencing those who have something critical to say already. And so from that angle, I wondered whether actually, wouldn't it be another avenue to work with, the POPs, the people's assemblies, where everyone can come and share critical views they have ready, and, like humanity does, try to ensure that that kind of space is as diverse and fair as it can be. And so I'm really actually curious to hear from those who have worked with popular assemblies, with people's assemblies, rather than sortition-based assemblies, like how difficult is that actually to achieve? Are there really promising stories? Because, we used to have lots of democratic theorists who were trusting the process to create deliberation, both participatory Democrats, Barber, Dewey, they were trusting the process of coming together would get people to be more other regarding and more open to hearing others' views and feeling more a sense of community cohesion just because people have come together and shared things. And deliberative Democrats, you know, Habermas used to also think that the process of deliberation is what allows people to listen to each other and understand that, you know, truth comes from what you can assert under conditions of having a heterogeneous group of people there. So was that naive of those theorists to think that we can trust the process to achieve those things rather than having completely neutral people in the room only? Or is it actually the case that there ends up being, I don't know, like a fight and no one talks to each other anymore?
Okay, so I think that's an invitation to the people who are experienced with the people's assemblies about, I suppose it's both about whether the passion gets in the way there, and then also about whether you can attract or you have participants from enough diversity, or whether you will just get people from the same bubble. I see that Elena's put her hand up, and I saw Jeremy put his physical hand up, which means I don't know what order those happen in, but I want to go Elena, then Jeremy, and then Sean. So Elena.
Yeah, really good point, Marit. I'm from Humanity Project, and we ran about 50 local assemblies in the last year all over the country, and then culminated in a national assembly where people who had attended the local POPs kind of came. And although it was very small, there are some important things to kind of discuss about you know, what actually happened. The people who were organizing in the localities also wanted to join in. You know, there's a kind of a real eagerness. And when you actually start looking at the kind of issues that mainly exploratory POPs that were held in localities, there was such a diverse range of issues, you know, from the kind of immediate frustrations of potholes to, you know, the other end of the spectrum is how do we change capitalism, you know. So you can't deal with things like that in about an hour's deliberation in a local POP. So I think, you know, that there were lots of expressions of interest for kind of going further with the process. And, you know, and when I hear, you know, that in citizens assemblies, which I have no experience of, you know, that you held 13 sessions, well, you know, it's amazing what can happen to a person's mind. So it's not at all surprising that you have these wonderful transformative stories emerging from it. So for me, the issue about linking local assemblies with citizens assemblies and how do we progress that concept of a local assembly into something more progressive and developmental and sustainable and ongoing in local communities. You know, we have to think about the level of organizing that has to happen, and that there's no money. People do this voluntary, and they were absolutely exhausted at just arranging, you know, between 5 or 6 of them, a local assembly. So that there are lots and lots of issues to think about when you dig down deep into actually what happens and what needed to happen to make a local POP happen, and how do you carry it on, and how do you take an exploratory assembly into something then that becomes a decision-making assembly, and especially decisions that will actually change the quality of people's lives in their locality.
Wonderful, thank you. Slightly reminds me of, is it the Oscar Wilde quote, the problem with socialism is it takes too many evenings, and that resourcing question is there. Jeremy, I think you were next.
Okay, mine's a very specific story. So when I was at Central St Martin's, we had a climate assembly. I was allowed to speak about number 9. I think Claire spoke number 1, so that set up the hierarchy. And I made a commitment to address any of the demands that came out of the assembly, and everyone broke up into tables, demands came out. It was a very risky commitment, that, by the way. And what was amazing about it was that the demands were very, very considered, and with that, rather reasonable. And so my lesson from that was that within the space of a climate assembly, a people's assembly in that case, if you give people a voice, they generally use it responsibly, unless they're political apparatchiks, in which case it's the reverse. And I think that was my story of the assembly, was the kind of a sense of empowerment of people who up to then, it was 400 students and staff came together amazingly, beautifully facilitated, and it was the giving of a voice was used responsibly.
So in a sense, to one of Marit's pushes, we can trust the process. Like if you have, so there was a Dewey, and I forget the other name of the academic you named, who said we can trust the process. People are worthy of our trust and will take the responsibility well. That was your experience there that I think I heard from you there, Jeremy. We have a little bit of a queue. Sean has had his hand up for a little while.
Yeah, also responding to the provocation from Marit. Yeah, thank you for that. And just thinking about how our experience in Hull, running, I say, people's assemblies across every neighbourhood in Hull over the last year or so, kind of fits in with the kind of tension between the usual suspects and having to work on sort of like bringing in diversity of individuals and trusting the process. And we've been running assemblies which have largely been exploratory. We've had some which have had trying to target practical outcomes, but they've largely been sort of spaces together and so this to have political conversations rather than like very specific how do we change climate policy type assembly. So they're both different in their scope to who they're trying to speak to citizens assemblies, but also in sort of the kinds of questions they're asking. They're more of a sort of more culturally embedded and more interested in developing that sort of self-organizing or responsible like political culture. And yeah, we've had to work quite hard in some ways at not getting just the usual suspects. Part of that has been a load of organisers moving to Hull to start running assemblies around the city and not doing them in London or other places. Part of that has been knocking on a whole load of doors. So like it's not a whole load of outreach in very specific targeted ways to reach out to people who wouldn't normally come up to these places and aren't normally sort of lefty organisers, which is the kind of people you tend to get at this sort of event who've heard of Occupy and similar movements. But at the same time, we also have kind of shown or experienced that the process is like holding the process well is really valuable, and often like quite frequently have had people who have very deeply opposing views around tense culture war issues, stuff which often online or in other kind of different sorts of spaces, deliberative spaces where people can have discussions would turn into sort of inflammatory debates and stuff around immigration. We haven't really had anything on trans issues, but climate and climate denialism and conspiracy theories and bringing people into a space and only quite lightly facilitating it, you do get those disagreements ironed out, and like that kind of trust, that kind of almost Habermasian trust in the process in some ways is there and should be there. But at the same time, most of the assemblies, as I say, have been very like, they've been quite big picture questions. They're stuff like why are we divided as a society and how can we be more united? Like, and some of them have been trying to embed them in sort of more organizing culture and more self-organizing on a grassroots level. And that's been the thought as theory of change, not the speaking to government. But yeah, and then speaking to sort of, that also speaks, I think, to something that Sue was saying earlier around like, haven't we always been able to like, Susan even likes to like organize or bring people together. And I think, yeah, that's to some extent true, but I think some of our experiences in Hull have shown that like that can be really difficult. There's a huge amount of nihilism and political sort of disenfranchisement, especially from the people who have most to gain from a new system and a new democratic system, the people who are most, at least in the UK, the most sort of disempowered by the current system. There's sort of a good idea, but will never work, is like you'll hear an awful lot. And that kind of culture of political culture is something that assemblies can bring, but they don't just bring it by themselves. They need to be embedded in a kind of different organizing culture. Well, that's what we seem to be finding anyway. And clearly that is a massive question of power, which is sort of what this whole discussion seems to be about. So yeah, that's sort of maybe some of the experiences in Hull that speak to that question.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sean. With James, then Lachlan. James.
Thanks, David. And thanks for facilitating. I love being facilitated.
You say that.
So I was sort of going to respond to Marit. I was sort of going to reflect on a story and maybe respond to it. It's really interesting listening to the chat, which I guess is the point of why we're here. Because one of the things that folks seem to say about the popular assemblies is they'll say, oh, they're good because anyone who wants to be there can be there. And then they'll say, oh, they're bad because they're not representative. And I'm sat here being like, I don't feel like both of those can be true, if you see what I mean. And my experience of popular assemblies is that they're not representative purely and precisely because, you know, most people aren't there. And it is a certain type of people who tend to come along to those things. And that's because also there's a whole load of structural barriers to loads of people attending stuff. So it's not the case that because of the society we live in, which is partly why we're all here, that anyone can go to something just because it's open to everyone. And we need to kind of remember that. But then I was reflecting on like, because in the past I've been involved in like a lot of community organizing. I've been involved in a lot of like assemblies of activists in fields or in streets. And I've also now in sortition. So I'm like, people keep talking to me about maths and shit that I don't understand. And it's very technical. So I feel like I've worked across all these different things. And one of my reflections is like, I've heard people describe like how they're different, like what the how their characteristics are different. But the question I'm struck with is like, how is their function different? Like, how do they function to get the future we want? And the thing about certainly my experience of like community organizing or assemblies of activists, or like, you know, the process of door knocking and bringing people together and being like, what's our shared interest, is that actually they don't have to be representative of everyone. They don't have to be majoritarian. They're not, you know, they're not the basis of like electoral politics where you're trying to find something that loads of people will vote for. And actually, so this question that you set up where you're like, oh, how do we get more people involved so it's more representative? I don't necessarily think that that would be a good thing if more people got involved, because part of the function of popular assemblies, as far as I'm concerned, is that there's a whole load of people whose interests are consistently not represented. And one of the functions of these popular assemblies is that it helps to visibilize the invisible suffering that is often like not seen or not part of the dialogue in our political culture. Do you know what I mean? And whereas now, because I'm at Sortition Foundation, I know that sortition-based assemblies consistently seek and produce supermajorities. And, you know, because they're quite often governmental, they're trying to find ways forward that are agreeable to like a diverse subsection. And I think that has another function as well. Do you know what I mean? Because movement assemblies or popular assemblies need to raise issues, as you said. But then also we live, and like those interests need to be elevated because normally they're marginalized. But then at the same time, these sortition-based assemblies need to find a way forward that like a broader group of people could get behind. And so that has a function too, in terms of like implementing movement demands into policy or et cetera, et cetera. Do you see what I mean? So So I think that's what I was struck by this sort of
James, do you mind if I facilitate you now by thanking you for your contribution and sort of summarizing your points as what are the different functions, the sort of different roles of these two different approaches, which you had as the popular assemblies often are giving a voice to those who are missing, their voices are missing from the rest of the political process, whereas the sortition about finding a way forward which can have a broader agreement behind it, some kind of supermajority, which means it can roll onwards. So thank you for that. Lachlan, I think you're going to be our last person I ask for stories, and then I have a question after the question to Claire. So Lachlan, what's your contribution?
Thank you very much. It was really, really enjoyable to listen to all of these really, really interesting takes. Yeah, so from my perspective, I've been working more on the kind of social movement side of things with Humanity Project and an organization called Assemble as well. And we're doing different but broadly kind of similar things in that we're kind of putting deliberative democracy into practice and trying to build a kind of dual power sort of strategy, building power outside of traditional systems. I just wanted to, reaffirm what's kind of been said, especially echoing what Sean had to say, that in order to bring people into these people's assemblies, you need proper community organizing and you need trained community organizers. So expecting, you know, the average punter to pull people into a room without the charisma of Jamie is very, very difficult. So I also, wanted to echo some of what James was saying as well, that actually these approaches can be complementary, citizens assemblies, but also people's assemblies. And I think we also need to think about these in a kind of mosaic of other kind of tools that we have. So listening campaigns where, let's say, you're going out and talking to people on doorsteps, as James said, just because you hold an open space, you can't expect people to actually come to it for a whole load of range of reasons. So building in, a listening campaign to get some of those perspectives, with kind of more like tech-based approaches as well. So not necessarily like seeing these approaches in kind of isolation. I guess that would be my main provocation and takeaway. Thanks. Check.
Thank you, Lachlan. And that's actually going to be the question I'll ask after we've heard from Nomeka. Is about one of the questions Graham ended his setup with, which was, how can these two things interact? So I'd love thoughts on how these two things interact. But first, we're going to hear from Nomeka, and apologies if I've mispronounced your name, but you're up.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. So I feel like a lot of etiquette around the meetings. I'm not quite familiar with them, so forgive me if I don't use it correctly. But I'm guessing this is a provocation, if it falls into that category. Listening to the conversation or reading about the tension between the people's assemblies and the sortition assemblies, I cannot but wonder if a lot of it might be theoretical, or perhaps we're overthinking it. Having attended some of these assemblies, people's assemblies, I work with Corporation Hall, and I don't quite see that tension because people naturally expect sortition assemblies to come after the people's assemblies. So I wonder if this the tension that we feel is more, we're overthinking it. That's for
last word. Whether the tension is in, and then you said a word which I didn't catch.
It's perhaps more the experts overthinking it, so to speak, and the people who are doing the assemblies or who are involved, the citizens themselves, are not, feeling this tension.
Great. Thank you. And I think that leads us into the question I was setting up just before you spoke, which is, how do these two things interact? Where is it that they can be generative? Are there moments, are there ways in which they are in conflict and shouldn't be tried to be used with each other? And I'd be really interested in any strong views that people have on this. We've already had some ideas. So one idea was the People's Assemblies doing the sort of setup and the agenda setting for a sortition. We've had a sortition assembly going and visiting many different people's assemblies as a way of getting more scale. And there are probably more ideas which I've missed because I've been trying to look at everyone's faces. Marit, you've put your hand up. I'm also interested in, there are some people who are here as participants who haven't had a chance to speak yet. So if you haven't, please do share when you get the chance, but over to you, Marit.
If someone else wants to go first, actually, Liam has his hand up. Maybe you can go first.
Let's go Liam and then Marit. So the question is, how can these two types of thing, how can they interact with each other? When can they be generative? When are they in conflict and avoid each other? Liam.
Yeah, so thanks for everyone that's contributed. I've thought it's been really interesting. The main contribution I'd probably have is that if we look at the history of deliberative democracy, how it's emerged, a lot of the time, and Graham, I know that you've talked about this in your recent book, the idea really is that it comes from political unrest. And I think when we talk about civil unrest, we're really talking about populism and polarization. And my take really is that when we have these different tribes of populism, it's necessarily going to be very inchoate and it's going to feel like an echo chamber, which is what people's assemblies are kind of built to do. It's to really show the extremes of public opinion, and within that, have the norms of deliberative democracy and try to find some consensus. So I think what Claire with an I was saying before, I think makes a lot of sense. I think deliberative democracy is a response to a time of populism. And I think we should treat it that way, and it should set agendas for citizens' assemblies. Because the one thing that I can't remember who said it before, but this idea of what's the difference, right? I think the difference is about legitimacy and the legitimacy of representation. And I think we can't suddenly forget that exists. Like the whole like idea of people like us deliberating has a strong element of legitimacy to it. And I think we should consider that, which is why I think citizens' assemblies do necessarily serve a role as well. There are problems with the whole like what should be represented. Should it be epistemic? Should it be demographic? Whatever. But I do think ultimately that's where the legitimacy does come from. So, yeah.
Thank you, Liam. Over to you, Marit, again on this question of how do these two things interact?
Yeah, thanks. Maybe following on from that, actually. So I agree about the legitimacy that comes with representativeness, but I guess on the other hand, there's the whole tradition in deliberative democracy where legitimacy is needed because of this issue of structural power. And one way of exerting power is actually to set an agenda and to frame a question in a certain way, which really citizens' assemblies have the ability to do, sometimes to undemocratizing effects. And so I wonder, whether it wouldn't be possible. Well, actually, I see it as very much necessary that there are at least not just citizens' assemblies at those kinds of high levels where we celebrate the people voice and all those things and kind of make it a really big deal, but actually at the expense of that being a very exclusive event that someone is very much in control of and has kind of control over the agenda. And so to me, it's absolutely vital that there are POPs, people's assemblies around that, so that there's actually a broader culture of democratic participation and critical thinking where people feel that they can voice their concerns even if they haven't been invited to take part in the proper assembly. And so I wondered actually whether we could reverse that, almost kind of maybe that assumed hierarchy between those types, and say actually the vital assemblies are the local ones that everyone can go to and voice concerns. And what if those actually set the agenda for a citizens' assembly to then kind of, have the 13 weeks or 13 sessions or whatever to look into issues in proper detail and proper depth? What if actually the local assemblies send some of the experts that can inform those processes? What if we had people who have critical views, members of movements, put forward their views as part of what the Citizens Assembly then considers, rather than it just being sort of something like supposedly objective knowledge type experts. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Just looking around to see if anyone else has a strong view they want to share on how these two different types of citizen engagement should interrelate with each other. I can't see anyone looking like they're bursting. Oh, Susan may be bursting.
I'm not bursting, but yeah, I had two thoughts really. One was just made me think that I use the Citizens Assembly approach in some planning, co-design work that I've been involved with. And of course, people are always mobilised around planning. And one of the things we've done with one of my clients is that we invite those mobilised communities to get involved in that process. Obviously, there can be a speaker or an expert if they want to, but they were allocated places so that the assembly, the randomly selected assembly, also had those active voices in the room as well, working with them. So that was one way, I guess, that we've incorporated those views, but not necessarily consciously in linking popular ones and the citizens ones. But I think that they should be not so much setting the agenda, but the people that take on the actions from them. So where there has been an assembly and there's a set of recommendations, how do we mobilise people to then take those recommendations forward, hold government to account, hold the agencies to account, and use that energy so they've got something that they can has got the legitimacy of the Citizens Assembly and the random selection, but actually serves the same purpose as they need to mobilise and create the change, and rather than the report sitting on the shelf.
Great, thank you, Susan. I think we'll hear from Nameka, and then maybe Graham before we go to Claire for themes. So Nameka. Oh. Maybe Steph as well. So we'll see what we can do. Nameka, is your hand still up?
Yes, it's still up. So once again, I'm walking into the rain, so pardon me. My experience with people's assemblies and citizens' assemblies, a lot of it has come from Nigeria, where because of a lot of times the effect of the government is not felt on the people, so people have to govern themselves using people's assemblies. And what I've noticed, the interaction is usually that the people's assemblies feed the citizens' assemblies, because the people's assemblies ultimately end up as just an avenue to be heard. And the citizens' assemblies are the vehicles for actually effecting change. Because at the end of the day, and these are real people's assembly where the passions are very high and people are screaming and all of it, and there's like maybe football size, a small, basketball field with people. And so ultimately it's people's emotions, and then they speak and people go home. And so the effective way to do that, to actually effect change, is that from there, whatever agenda is set, whatever opinions those people have that they feel strongly about, is now passed to the citizens' assembly type places, and they effect those changes. Now, I've been here and seen some of this work, reading some of this. I've seen like there's an academic difference to it, but at the end of it, when you dig down, you still see it's like the general public have their say, and the sortition assemblies effectively do the execution, so to speak. And one other point I wanted to make is, and this is, of course, it might be anecdotal because I'm speaking from my own experience, is that ultimately almost every assembly is a sortition assembly, because somebody decides who to invite, somebody decides what doors to knock on, somebody decides what communities. It's like in Corporation Hall, some people decided to hold their assemblies in hall. Somebody makes that decision and goes, and then has to make a conscious effort to reach out to other people. So I think whatever tension is this, we should accept it, because it's just some tension has to exist if the work has to be done.
Great, thank you for that. I mean, slightly hearing that the perfect is the enemy of the good, in the sense that all forms will have their shadow side. So we should accept that they will have those shadow sides. We've had at various points the last few moments, Steph and Jamie and Graham indicate they want to speak. Jamie, is it possible for you to be quite brief with us so we can go to...
How's it going?
Nice, go well.
Hi.
Go well.
Hi.
Helen.
Hi, Helen.
Okay. Very cool day. What are you doing out on the street?
Just taking a walk.
As host, thank you. Jamie, just a little snippet from you, please.
I don't want to try and... it's okay, pass over to someone else in that case.
Wonderful. Steph.
I very briefly, I think let's try some sort of place-based experiments where these things are happening in parallel and work it out.
Excellent. We couldn't really have asked for a shorter input than that. Thank you. And Graham, you had a point which I think followed on from Susan. What was it you...
Yeah, I'll try to be short, but I don't think I can quite do Steph short. But and I think another way of looking about this is, I think both, from hearing what people have been saying, is on both sides of the argument, whichever format you work with, you have challenges in relation to impact strategies and trying to think about how do we make sure these things have impact. And I have this feeling that thinking about it in those terms may actually also help us think about how the other formats may actually enable impact, whether it's impact from grassroots or whether it's impact from starting from a sortitions basis. And I think this is it's worth probably putting that hat on and thinking about the types of impacts we're trying to get, whether it's public discourse, whether it's getting actually things done on the ground, whether it's empowering individuals or whatever. And I think that could actually be quite a creative way of starting from the sort of limits of the impacts of these things rather than sort of thinking them in abstract terms.
Right, and in a way that's a build on James' Sortition Foundation B is available from Good Pharmacists, that what are the functions, what are the different roles, what are the different impacts of these different formats, and therefore which ones are the best to choose for any one particular situation and in what combination.
And I think if I only ever build on James, then I feel I've succeeded.
With that, I think we will hand to Claire, who's been given the task, the happy, easy task of trying to come up with, we've said in advance 5 themes. Let's see how well she has done on that. Claire, give us our starter for 10 on 5 themes that people can respond to in our last quarter of an hour or so.
Well, one really important theme that's come up is something that I feel is at the sort of heart of some of this debate, which is about what I see in the movement as people who are interested in process and people who are interested in an outcome. And the transformational process that people go through is obviously fantastic and exciting and beautiful. But there's also people going, yeah, but what's it going to achieve? And it won't work and you won't get the change to happen. And those two people are usually a different person. It's a very, very challenging thing to hold together. I can see Lucky laughing at me. But also the cross-pollination conversation I think is super exciting. I really think what I was hoping was going to happen by bringing people together who might not normally talk about this stuff, from Cooperation Hull or Humanity Project or XR, people who are organising these kind of grassroots assemblies with some of the practitioners who do the proper sortition assemblies or more resourced people or academics, is this sort of just being interested in what can be the cross-pollination between us as people who are all interested in making all of this work and making a democracy better. So the cross-pollination of the two sort of ways of working is a major theme. There is the resourcing question and the practical barriers, and getting people in the room is a massive theme. I know it's really hard to mobilize people into something that's not as sort of dramatic as everyone going out on the streets and getting arrested with lots of colourful flags and it being all very exciting. It's sort of a different mobilization gig to try and do the community organising stuff. So I think that, you know, working with little resources and trying to get people in a room, and particularly trying to get people in a room who don't show up easily because they might have some serious practical issues, but also they might have some serious personal sort of doubts about whether they should be there. I know Maff from the Camerado said one of his public living rooms, the people had to set it up on the street because they set it up in a centre and no one was coming in. And he said people just wouldn't come in the door. And so he suggested they did it on the wall outside instead. And then it started to work. People came and spoke to them because they didn't have to go over the threshold into a room. So there's this sort of barriers question. And I'm interested in this piece that comes up about sort of where the most critical voices are, or the most impassioned voices or whatever. Like, are they actually quite important? And if they are, you know, how do they sit alongside other things? And I know that's sometimes seen as sort of something that illegitimizes something when there's too many people somewhere that care too much about a thing. But arguably, you know, those people know a lot about the thing that they organize around usually, you know, and they can be seen as experts. And I suppose the last thing is, for me on this sort of short list, is about, you know, trust and populism. And it feels like there's a real conflict there between the idea of sort of building processes where people sort of build bridges and connection and overcome differences, and this sort of notion of something populist and powerful and pushing forward the agenda of people who are being ignored or oppressed or marginalized or whatever. That feels really interesting point of sort of consideration, which also is basically kind of the same point as the first one about sort of, you know, process versus outcome. In a way, it sort of sits in the same space for me. But that's just some of my theme notes. Hope that was all right, David.
Land for people. Could you just say the headlines of those? I think it was 4, just so people have a chance to absorb them again and react. So if you were to give them headlines, what would they be?
Process versus outcome, or almost sort of impact versus transformation of persons in the space. Cross-pollination, quite interesting suggestions about different ways they can work, and both directions. Start with a People's Assembly, do a sortition assembly, or the other way around. Or maybe they're not up or down, maybe they're sort of cross-pollination. Diversity and mobilization and barriers, I suppose, which includes resourcing. And then trust and passion and represented people versus sort of seemingly not politicized people, I suppose is the last one. Sorry, that wasn't still very good headlines, was it?
Well, the ones I sort of captured would be personal transformation versus outputs and outcomes, cross-pollination between these two forms. Thirdly, diversity, mobilization, and I can't read my own writing there, but that's that third one. And then fourth and final, trust, passion, and representative versus not political or not politicized people. So that was my attempt to get that quickly. Now, everyone, of course, can object to those as themes and say they're rubbish and think they're completely wrong, or you can augment one of them and say, well, actually, I take it in this direction, or you could have a new theme from the conversation you've heard so far that you'd like to add to the pot. So we've got a few minutes for people to say, what else have you heard? What else would you like us to take away from this event and take into the other 5 and the summary at the end? Perry.
I wanted to add the theme of legitimacy, which a couple of people mentioned, and which I think is another way of thinking about both, as well as impact strategy. So I think citizens' assemblies are legitimate when opinion is being expressed, but they're not so legitimate as people's assemblies when, for example, lived experience is required. So I remember doing a people's assembly on the future of a mobile library service. And in order to find out when those libraries should stop and what they should stock and so on, you didn't need a representative sample. You need people with a lived experience of the service. Legitimacy.
Cool. Wonderful. So wonderfully modeled for us also headline, explanation, and all over in a quick amount of time, which means you can get to hear from more people with things that they'd like to add and say that they've heard from the conversation this evening. Has anyone else got anything they'd like to add? Paul?
Yeah, I mean, just a very brief summation, but speaking versus acting. So, you know, assemblies on both sides, there's a lot of speaking, but let's add action as part of that speaking and acting. That's it.
Great, thank you. Looking around for other kinds of themes. Jamie?
Just wanted to reinforce that acting. I think the word is around impact. So in the block that I live here now, we use people's assemblies to bring the block together. And what made the huge difference was people were articulating what was the most important stuff to address, and we acted on it. So it was looking after the kids. So we set up a volunteer-led youth club here, a kids gardening club, and it was also it's so multicultural. So we got money from the local council. Each different culture got 20 quid. We had a picnic where each culture did their traditional dish, and everyone started fucking talking to each other, and that instantly made this really expand really quickly, you know. And we're 20 years into that. We're still feeding from these initial experiences using assembly. So action, as Paul is saying, or impact, they're absolutely vital. Also, I think what Leo Elstob was pointing out, sorry, Stefan Elstob was pointing out much earlier on, if you are going to use assembly to choose what the themes should be for sortition assemblies, it's all about who you get in the room for the assembly. And I've literally done hundreds of these. I've run loads of assemblies around here. I've run them around the country. I train people to run them. I got 8 people in as councillors back in North Devon. And how you word the invitation, how you facilitate it, absolutely determines what kind of people are going to be in the room, right? And unless that's worked out really well, then you're just going to get retired people because they've got the time. People are going there because they want the free food, and lefties and progressive. In fact, quite a lot of the time, you get homeowners who want to, they bought their council flats. They want to make sure everything is really safe for their investment and stuff, right? It's really narrow. Widening it out is really difficult. So that's to do with the wording of the invitations, the way it's facilitated, but also word gets out if you have impact, right? And that's really, really important part of it. Otherwise, it's not representative, And then Graham's put a thing in the chat that I think is really important, which is this conversation is really important, and there should be more of it. My experience doing the Global Assembly with Claire Mellier, I thought it was a piece of fucking genius to realize that community assemblies for us was the opportunity for people in the world to download and go through a version of the learning that the Global Assembly is going through. That was fantastic. And I think that's where these could intersect really, really well. You've got a Citizens Assembly happening in the UK, but if you have a really well-run campaign, anyone in the country could get a community together, a nunnery, a rugby club, Boy Scouts, Year 8, and they download a version of that learning and go through an assembly. When we did it with the Global Assembly, it was 3-hour version, 8-hour version, 2-day version. I thought that was a bit of genius, and I think there's a lot to be had in that. But I just do want to kind of underline something. This is fraught with danger. You can't just plow on in and set up assemblies and then let everyone down, because you just put them off.
Well,
and as they found out in Hull, one of the real problems is if you really listen to the assembly, what do you really want to talk about? A lot of them go, we want to stop the boats, mate. You need to handle that well, right?
Thank you. I think I just want to make sure we give space for any other thoughts from other people. But I think there is also an interesting connection between that, proving that you are taking action, demonstrating the action comes from the assemblies as a source of legitimacy almost, as well as momentum. So just want to reinforce that. I'm looking forward to the Citizens Assembly, which combines the nunnery with the rugby team. Claire, what?
Maybe that's a question for some of the other session that will happen. But for me, the resourcing is a big one, because at the moment we are almost making assumptions that the popular assemblies are like a bit of a lower grade version because they don't have the resourcing. But I'm really interested in how actually funders and start to realize, actually, if you think in terms of the deliberative system, and if you want to create deliberative opportunities across, the system, then you need to scale, then you need to build capacity, then you need to expand, and that comes with resources. And at the moment, I think we are caught in that, where a lot of philanthropic organizations are really behind, they don't get it. So there's a massive learning that needs to happen. So that's where I'm at the moment, is like, there's always a bit of an assumption that the Citizens Assemblies are better because they're better resourced. And that's the case at the moment. But I think with resource, we could get amazing processes that build community resilience. That, there was the Festival of Commoning in Strand recently that Claire came to speak at. And that's what people are saying, long-term, how do we set up long-term governance infrastructures in our community that are going to be able to respond to the challenges we face, especially in terms of community resilience. So yeah, maybe for another session.
Great, thank you. And we have in the chat 3 things which you can read about Graham and Steph and James. James responding to Steph. Probably have time for at most one more thought on a theme, which if somebody could say that in 1 minute or less, that would be fantastic. Otherwise, we'll move towards closing. So a final opportunity, particularly for someone who's not spoken very much, who'd like to share their reflections or a theme that they've heard that want to make sure we go away with. Going once, going twice. Stefan. Stephen, even.
Yeah, Stephen, no problem. I would just pick up on, I think it's been a theme of the conversation, but James has just posted something, a comment in the chat, so I'll just pick on that. That I think it's true sortition assemblies do have limited power and influence, and by creating a critical mass around them and their recommendations through linking with popular assemblies, I think this can add weight to them. So on one level, the recommendations go to policymakers and then they do or don't implement them. But the power of public opinion, if they're able to show, look, it's not just the 100 people in the sortition assembly, but it's these communities who've participated in the popular assembly and they're endorsing these recommendations as well. That can give it more weight and it can be more difficult for policymakers to ignore. And that's why I think there are synergies, as Graham's been alluding to, there are synergies between these two different types of forums that combining them can bring tensions as well, as we've discussed.
Wonderful, thank you. That feels like a great thing to end with. So just a big thank you for me. This is the first of 6 sort of deliberations around different themes within assemblies, which Claire and the team are organising. Over to you, Claire, for a final comment. And Josh is able to show us his illustration that he's been making live as well. So Claire for the close and Josh for the illustration.
Thanks so much. That's been such a fabulously helpful and rich discussion, and I'm just really grateful for everyone coming and spending the time having it, and also hopefully building some bridges between all of our different worlds. And the closing comment from you, James, is really important, because I think, you know, I've been working on the Humanity Project for 2 years now, and part of the assessment that we made was that, you know, if you have a sortition-based assembly and it can't get the things to actually happen, then how do you build a movement that's going to be so supportive of assemblies, because everyone loves them because they do them? Then you build the social power that's going to make a movement that makes the demands of the sortition assembly impossible to ignore, or some kind of configuration of that. And I think given the riots, given the situation now, the Labour government, blah, blah, lots of things have changed since we set up what we started out with, and lots of things have evolved. So this has just been super helpful for me, and I really appreciate everybody's time in thinking about it. And I also am very grateful to Josh, because in a kind of in real time kind of way, we're trying to experiment with how a deliberation like this can also result in some kind of creative outputs that leave you with like a memento or something that may be more interesting for somebody to look at, so you can talk about what happened. That's not just a Zoom recording or a dusty old PDF or whatever. Josh, do you want to talk so that your thing goes big on the screen? So, because I can only see it small.
Or if everyone pins it, then it will make it big on their screen, as that can happen. One thing in terms of making connections, if we were able to email this to everybody and let everyone see each other's emails, if you have any objections to that, please let Alex know. Otherwise, we'll assume you are okay with sharing emails with everybody else. Josh, and of course, we're now at 31 minutes past, so I've broken my promise to end at 1:30. My apologies. You're allowed to leave. Of course you are. Josh, if you want to give us a little commentary on your sketch, and that will be our close.
Sure. Hello. Yes, okay. I haven't looked at it myself yet. I've been too busy scribbling. In the top left-hand corner, I have used these geometric shapes to represent the sortition space of the square, the Citizens Assembly of the circle, and the triangle to create the sense of power structures. And beneath that, we've got some kind of working out of a blueprint. This is to represent how they all fit together. And we've got the questions: how do we blend all of these things into one and link these styles and ways of and approaches of working? And how do we then, that led on to the conversation of how you bring it into the public sphere. And then the next sort of column along, some captions, capturing some of the quotes about the things that happen in France, about the fear of kind of fringe elements coming into the, and sort of suspicions amongst these assemblies, and how you allay these fears, and then how do you set the agenda for a public assembly? Like, who's finding the right words and the appropriate words? And below that, we have a little black cloud representing that the accounts of cynicism before an assembly led to an inspiration. We've got sunshine coming out from behind the cloud there to show that actually the people that involved were inspired afterwards. And that leads on to this idea that agency is and has always been in the hands of the public. And that we move along, we could see a few more quotes, and this idea of trust the process. How do we find trust through listening campaigns, community leaders? How do we mobilize? What impacts do we have? And then in the bottom right-hand corner there, some of Claire's headlines. And right down at the bottom, very small, it says, how do we find the unusual suspects? And I've got a little line up there representing in stick figures the unusual suspects. So that's it.
Wonderful. Amazing you're able to do that in that time. Thank you everybody for your contributions, and see some of you at one of these in the future. And in the meantime, please enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.